Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is Michael Maybach. I'm a trustee of the Institute of World Politics and one of their alumni. We welcome you this afternoon to this session entitled Countering Islamic Extremism by Orchestrating the Instruments of National Power. We have two IWP professors, excellent experts on our topic. I'm going to introduce them first, Professor Sustrand, and then after he speaks, Chris Harmon. So as way of introduction of our topic today, it's fair to say despite suffering repeating setbacks in recent years, Islamic extremism, or more specifically totalitarian Islamism, and the terrorism it spawns around the world remains a major threat to the United States and our allies. While there will always be a need for the selective use of military power, or hard power as we call it sometimes, to counter this threat, effectively addressing it requires non-military tools of statecraft. And statecraft, of course, is what we specialize at IWP. This webinar for the next hour will discuss how the United States and our international partners can better use those tools, those soft power tools, to win the fight against terrorism without over-reliance on combat operations. Our first presenter is a professor of international relations at the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College and adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics. Professor Douglas E. Sustrand has studied politics and warfare, primarily in the Islamic world, for more than 40 years. He has written 2 books on Islamic empires of the early modern period and edited a third on the Reagan administration's grand strategy, as well as articles and chapters in a wide variety of topics. So, Doug, if may I call you that, would you start out by telling us what is this Islamism in terms of a challenge to the West? How would you define it?
Well, thank you, Michael. The way that I define the ideology of the enemy is totalitarian Islamism. The way that I describe the enemy with which we're engaged is the totalitarian Islamist network or network of networks. Within this network are a number of nodes, many of them we're familiar with. The Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxy Hezbollah, the Al-Qaeda networks, the networks associated with the so-called Islamic State. And these nodes cooperate and compete for example, fight each other as the Taliban and the affiliate of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, recently between Al-Qaeda and so-called Islamic State affiliates in Burkina Faso. But they also cooperate. With military force and other forms of hard power, we can disrupt, degrade, weaken, occasionally perhaps even destroy some of these nodes. But the problem is that as long as they can continually regenerate through recruitment, the struggle will go on. And only the kinds of non-military power, soft power, that Dr. Harmon is going to talk about can actually lead to an end, or at least a marginalization of the struggle. So to go on to discuss totalitarian Islamism as an ideology, and I emphasize the word ideology. When the West first encountered this threat in the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and then after the 9/11 attacks, the West in general, classified it as a threat from another civilization or from a religion, and put it in a different category from the struggles against totalitarian ideologies in the West that occupied us for most of the 20th century and that we succeeded in winning. What we are confronting is certainly not traditional Islam, or even a form of Islamic thought that developed within the Islamic tradition, but a hybrid ideology that developed in dialogue with Western radical traditions and is an inherently modern revolutionary ideology that conceptually and functionally resembles Marxism-Leninism. It is not a form of religious conservatism. And we need to draw on the same array of instruments of national power as we did successfully in winning the Cold War to defeat it.
On that, can I just ask, more than one person has said that Islam is a religion that's been hijacked. Is that fair to say, or is that just a bad way to think about?
Well, I think hijacking is an accurate term as long as we realize that only a small percentage of Muslims, although quite a large number in absolute terms, have actually been affected by or been carried off, shall we say, by the hijacking. The ideology that we are up against developed starting in the 1930s with the encounter between Muslim intellectuals and the ideologies of radical dissent that spread from Europe through the European empires. And
so you're talking about Marx and Lenin?
Yes, very much so.
And what appealed to them about that? Just that they were revolutionary ideas against the power structure, or
there was, I guess, the dominant discourse of resistance to the Western powers, and were pervasive among the intellectuals of the European colonies. In particular, totalitarian Islamism relies on the concept of revolutionary vanguard, which the totalitarian Islamist intellectuals, beginning with the South Asian Abu Ala Maududi, borrowed directly and explicitly from Lenin. So it is very clear from the beginning that this ideology is not something that came out of reading the Quran and the Hadith alone. In fact, the reading of the Quran and Hadith reflects the revolutionary background, the Western education of most totalitarian Islamists on the Sunni side, who reject the authority of the traditional ulama entirely.
So, Doug, there's a school of thought that, we wouldn't have radical Islamic revolutionary thoughts if it wasn't for the West's intervention in that region, colonization, installing the Shah in Iran. So is this sort of a reaction against imperialism or a form of nationalism, or is it different than that?
Well, it includes both of those things provided the nationalism that you talk about is a nationalism that purports to speak for the entire Muslim community, the Ummah.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we do not have the opportunity of going back 100 years or 200 years and changing history. I mean, there is the great observation of Samuel Butler that God tolerates the existence of historians because they can change history and he can't. But nonetheless, we don't have that option. And although totalitarian Islamism would never have gotten a grip on many Muslims if there were not concrete grievances, just like Marxism would never have gained traction in the West if there weren't exploited industrial workers, or hadn't been. And Nazism would never have gained power in Germany if there weren't grievances over the World War I settlement. But in none of these cases would merely satisfying the grievances, even if it were possible, end the commitment to the ideology. One could not have bought off Hitler with a territorial settlement. He would eventually have gone to war. So once the grievances lead people to the ideology, or the ideology appeals to them more because of their personal circumstances or personal characteristics, dealing with the concrete grievances can't solve the problem.
So it becomes almost cultural from the word cult, which is a way of behaving as a way of life. And so what you're saying is their ideology has become so much part of at least the culture of some in the Muslim religion that there is no give, there is no moderation or compromise, because this is jihad for them in a political sense.
Well, one has to remember that some individuals do change their minds, just as many of the most determined anti-communists were former communists. But the term cult is useful because even though this is an ideology, it is the interpretation of a religion as a totalitarian ideology, as opposed to the religion itself.
Right.
It has the characteristics, the psychological characteristics of a cult. And that makes it, which makes it very difficult to counter once individuals are committed to it. And again, raises the importance of dealing with recruitment through non-military instruments.
Right. And this may get into where Chris is going to be addressing, but we just had the UAE, after I think it's been 29 years since Jordan recognized diplomatically Israel. Does that have anything to do with this? Is that seen by radical Muslims as a major problem that UAE has now done this? Or
I would say that the totalitarian Islamists would say that it justified killing every citizen of the United Arab Emirates.
Wow.
That it constitutes effectively apostasy.
My God.
I've never actually seen a statement like that.
Yeah.
But that's what the ideology would recommend. And you know, the leadership of the United Arab Emirates is determined to make it a cosmopolitan and effective player on the world stage, unbound by its cultural background. And I think they would agree that they might like to play a role in the world comparable to that of, for example, our valuable ally Norway.
Well, just go to Abu Dhabi and you'll get a sense they really want to be a cosmopolitan country right down the road from camels. It's really quite stunning.
Well, I don't think they want to leave the camels behind. They just don't want to. They just don't want to have to live with them.
That's right.
But the point is that it is as valid to think about the United Arab Emirates, which has just started its first nuclear plant and sent a probe to Mars, as well as recognizing Israel, all within the last 4 to 6 weeks, is as valid a symbol of what's going on in the Islamic world as the barbarous murderers of the so-called Islamic State, and is more representative of the mindset of the vast majority of Muslims.
Yeah, right. I think that's right. Can I ask you, we've heard, especially a few years ago, this idea of the restoration of the caliphate until Abu Baghi was killed by the United States. And I think that, and of course, they lost so much territory under President Trump that they had gained under the last administration. Is that the right way to think about this, that the radical Islamicists are interested in a new caliphate, or is that just the wrong word?
Well, a radical Islamicist would be a radical student of Islam. The only form of government that exists within the framework of Sunni Islamic law is a caliphate. Therefore, whatever government they advocate, they have to call a caliphate. But the restoration that they talk about is not actually a return to a historical past, but a vision of a utopian in theory, therefore dystopian in practice, future projected back on the past. So that many people have said, well, they want to restore the caliphate, they want to go back to the 13th century. No, they don't want to go back to the 13th century. They want to create what they define as a perfect Islamic society in the 14th Islamic century. But it has not. But it is not a remembered past. It is a utopia, a vision of the future projected into the past.
Right. So they remembered the future by imagining the past.
Right. They project their imagination of the future onto the past.
Yes.
But they're a totalitarian Islamist caliphate would look much more like the Soviet Union under Stalin than like anything in the past history of Muslim societies.
Okay. Well, Doug, thank you very much. I want to introduce Chris Harmon now. Chris, so Doug has tried to give us in a short period of time a sense of what is really going on when we talk about radical Islamic behavior and networks around the world. Christopher C. Harmon began teaching terrorism and counterterrorism courses at IWP just after 9/11, which is when I met him. He wrote his political science dissertation in that field in the early 1980s, has lectured worldwide, and is the lead author or editor of 5 books on terrorism. The latest is a 2018 book from the prestigious press of the Brookings Institution called The Terrorist Argument, Modern Advocacy and Propaganda. Dr. Harmon holds the Bren Chair of Great Power Competition at the Marine Corps University and its foundation. So both of these gentlemen teach both at IWP and they teach warriors at different institutions as well. And so we welcome Chris. Chris, you're going to talk, I think, about some of the antidotes or how to address without military power some of the problems presented by the radical revolution of Islam these days.
Thank you, Mike. I do want to take the conversation in that direction now based on the good foundations about ideology that you discussed with Doug. I want to talk a little about the sort of way we might orchestrate better our elements of soft power. And then specifically, I want to focus on who should be speaking while we're trying to do this public information, and then what should they say. And the latter I've found to be one of the most intriguing questions. I think we Americans haven't figured it out, even though we've been thinking about this for 2 decades, about what to say to the world about this ideology that Dr. Struzan's described. So back to the question about the elements of national power. Of course, a strength of the way IWP approaches things, and Dr. Lenchowski has a book on how one might do this. With respect to Islamism, which is, of course, a peculiar current enemy, I think I want to make a couple of quick observations. One is we shouldn't be obsessed with synchronizing our messages. We should be content in a pluralistic society with pluralistic rejoinders to the ideological offensive that we face.
Synchronizing with the enemy or with each other?
We should not worry about entirely synchronizing our own rejoinders to the enemy, Mike. I've been to many a conference where, they say the first thing is to get everybody on the same page as though we're singing in a chorus. No, that's not right. That isn't how democracies really work. That's not what we really feel about this. And it would discount the wonderful diversity in America and in the prospects for everything from, let's say, a businessman's council, a Lions Club, a rabbi or an imam, a clerical council of specialists in Islam. There are so many different kinds of voices, and they don't have to be all synchronized. Secondly, I think we can do much better by being better on the defense, but also starting an offense. In other words, I think we've been playing a kind of weak defense for 20 years on this ideological issue. So the major elements then of power, besides our wonderful special forces and, for example, the economic sanctions, which have been really skillfully used by successive administrations against Iran, I think. The elements of power include things like diplomacy, public diplomacy, intelligence, psychological operations. We have in our diplomatic quiver, of course, offices at State Department which deal with the issue, and I like the work that Ambassador Nathan Sales is doing. He came into state from DHS and Justice, and he's quite good. We are party to useful international colloquia. So we co-founded with Turkey. It's nice to know that at least a few years ago we could work with them closely. We co-founded with Turkey the council that we call the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which has done some really good work, especially something called the Ankara Memorandum from 2013 that I hope we have time to discuss.
Is that still active then, even though Turkey has changed its leadership?
Yeah, it sure is. They do things all the time, and there are about 30 parties, including the European Union. The State Department also puts out a very good report. So the one on 19 is now out, and that is called Country Reports on Terrorism. It's a detailed and useful. In public diplomacy, we then use some of those implements, and we have offices within state that include, for example, a fairly youngish crew that work on cyber issues. So radicalization is done on the web. We're pushing back on the web. We have people that are tech savvy and sort of alert to all the different social media operations. That could be far bigger an office and far more expansive an agenda, but we at least have that. In intelligence and psychological operations, these are things we wouldn't necessarily see as citizens, but they can do good things like damaging directly a violent extremist organization like Al-Qaeda, whose leader we still can't find after all these years. And they have options to do things like, well, there's something publicized recently called Task Force Ares, A-R-E-S, and citizens can read about it on the web. A military task force went right after some of the servers and web services of the worst of the Islamist terrorists, and they took a lot of them down, and it was very effective. So what we need, Mike, is a series of new initiatives by these kinds of offices. I don't think they're going to cost a lot of money. I think they need stronger leadership, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about who some of those good leaders might be.
So, Chris, what might be a model? Is the Cold War model what the U.S. orchestrated? I mean, we didn't go to war with the Soviet Union, but we certainly did everything but. Is that a model, or is that just too binary, if you will?
I kind of like the Cold War model, and good people like Dr. Strusen have done books and book chapters suggesting it's a worthy model. The Isaac Press in McLean, Virginia, has released a couple volumes that sometimes cover it from that angle. We recognized there was a threat. We knew that it was far more than military, and we recognized its psychological and political dimensions. And people like Ronald Reagan just intuitively grasped that. And he, of course, was especially good because he was so positive. This is not going to be won by only criticizing the worst excesses of the Islamists. It's got to be won by including things like proper understanding of a civil society and of rule of law. And it's got to be understood that this is, we can make a better world for everyone, and that includes the Muslims, who are the first. I don't mind saying that. I've said it for years. Muslims are the first to be damaged by most of these Islamist organizations.
So when you ask the question, or raise the question, who are the best speakers in the United States? Should that be members of Congress, the president, academia, all of the above?
I really agree with that, Mike. I really looking for a kind of whole of community approach, as they say, or whole of society. There are so many operations that are promising. I've met in my own time a number of expert women, for example, who deal directly with women's groups. So, one of my more interesting conferences was in the Maldives, and I met a Ruby Khalifa, who's an expert academic there from Indonesia, and she can so well address, as a Muslim, Muslim women on this issue. She's attuned in ways I never would be to how Southeast Asia's youth, which are a very ripe recruiting ground, will look to the world and to a recruiter for ISIS or Al-Qaeda. To take another example, there's quite a lot of think tanks and government entities that are working on this now that have very good things to teach, including Singapore's Religious Rehabilitation Group, which has published a series of fine reports. Hidayah, in a center in Abu Dhabi. There are quite a few. I'm a fan, although this is contentious, and I don't know if Doug has a comment. I'm a fan of the Quillian Foundation in London. These guys are mostly defectors from Islamist but non-terrorist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir. They believe in the caliphate, or did, and they believe in kind of the covert work that Doug was alluding to and the fierce ideology, but they allege that they were anti-terrorist. Well, they left those groups and they now work against extremism. So they're quite contentious, but Majid Noaz has done a couple of books. They give very fine speeches, and unlike, let's say, me or you, they can speak from inside an organization. And they're very good. And I would add quickly, and then I'll ask Doug to comment on this notion of Islamists who aren't overt terrorists at all. That is, set aside, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah. People like the Muslim Brotherhood, they're really well dealt with by two books by Lorenzo Vidino, and his latest is out this year from Columbia. The Closed Circle is based upon defectors, and each chapter covers a person who's been inside and who's seen the inside. Those people can be very effective. And then in our own government, I have a few names that I think do exceptionally well on the American scene. But I'd like Doug to talk about this question of who should be speaking, because I insist that it's not just one person from the Department of State.
Doug, do you have some comments?
I agree, Chris, that it can't but just be one person or one organization. I also agree with you about the Quillian Foundation. The question is in part, who should be saying what and how much should the United States actually be involved? We do not want mainstream Islam to get a made in America stamp on it. We want to facilitate mainstream spokesmen, anti-totalitarian spokesmen, spokeswomen. But the things that we say in our own voice need to recognize our limitations. We cannot judge, we lack the standing to judge whether someone is a Muslim or not, or is a good Muslim or not. But the primary thing is that, or primary point, is that the totalitarians want to define the global struggle as between Islam and the West, and identify themselves as the true defenders of Islam. We need to define the struggle differently. Their definition seeks to broaden the community of enemies of the West, their recruiting pool, as far as possible. We should seek to narrow the struggle and narrow their and decrease their recruiting pool.
Yeah, let me break in there and say that I think the decisive point is when Americans speak, they are in very good position. They don't need any special standing to address this issue of ideology when it causes terrorism. So let me give an example that I think almost proves this beyond doubt, that whatever we may think about the issue, when it comes to terrorism, even the United Nations has now managed a definition, it's a good one too, in its Treaty on Terrorist Financing. In a long series of council resolutions, there is good, solid, broad denunciation of terrorism. Moreover, groups signed on to things like 2178 some years back, which very carefully and explicitly condemn under Chapter 7 now, which entails the potential use of force under the UN, things like radicalization, recruitment, violent extremism, incitement to terrorist acts, the web when it's used in those ways. Now, here's my point. It isn't just about us or how we feel, and we don't need to be defensive when we're abroad in an international conference. Countries have all signed this kind of legislation. They all publish these kind of denunciations. So when we get to the issue of terrorism from extremists, we've got almost a global consensus. I wouldn't mind saying, and you guys remember, in the 1970s, when we were all thinking about this, we had no such consensus. This required the building of it by great people like, say, George Shultz at State and 1,000 others, Jeane Kirkpatrick. We have it now. We've got our view well expressed at the UN. And so when an American diplomat or academic or anybody wants to address these things, there are certain elements of unanimity now when the ideology has produced terrorism. So, would I join? Would I join a series of 3 men and women who defected from Hizb ut-Tahrir? No, I would be a rather awkward fit. But if the conference they're holding is on terrorism, as an American, I might have something to say, even though I've never been a Muslim.
Okay, I've got 3 or 4 questions, and I want to walk through them fairly quickly with both of you. So I think we are making an assumption here, but I want to test this, that Islam itself is a religion of peace. And what's happened is, in the name of Islam, there's been a radical ideology that it's sort of stood on top of, but that the Islam religion itself, because people say the Quran says all kinds of things. Is it fair to say Islam is a religion of peace and that this has been abused by these revolutionaries?
I would not say that any religion is a religion of peace. Religions are, in the phenomenal world, in the real world, what their believers make it. Islam can be a religion of peace, and I think the vast majority of Muslims would interpret it that way. But I don't like the idea of saying that that Islam has a single unchanging essence, whether based on text or not. Certainly, the Christian scriptures can have a strong pacifist message. Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. But that has not prevented Christians from wielding the sword in the name of Christianity. So I would say Islam is what Muslims make it. And unfortunately, the argument that the real Islam is a religion of peace has led some well-meaning individuals, including individuals within the US government, to accept some groups and doctrines as benign just because they call themselves Islamic.
Okay.
And
let's have Chris. So Chris, are you in harmony with what Doug just said about Islam? You're on mute, Chris. Chris, you're on mute. Yeah, you both should be unmuted.
I think he spoke. I think he spoke well. I wouldn't make that kind of generalization either. I think that the key is a lot of Muslims recognize and reject the terrorists within. So there are no end of good documents, and I try to keep up with them. Letters from collections of imams, the Mardan Declaration made in Turkey in 2010. I have many of these things in which very good Muslims, very learned ones, have thoroughly and completely repudiated terrorism and said this is no excuse for talking in Islamic terms. One of the prime ministers of Malaysia 5 years ago made a magnificent speech in which he said, don't blame these terrorists on my faith. So they understand, and I think we do well in our government if we would amplify those voices a lot more than we do. It doesn't require us to be a Muslim, but it makes it clear how out of the mainstream the terrorists are.
Now, if I may add to that, unfortunately, the mainstream American media have done far better at asking why Muslims are not condemning terrorism than at reporting when they do. But at the same time, it is very important for us not to put these condemnations, these Muslim condemnations of terrorism, in particular, the categorical denial that it meets the definition of jihad as warfare, the legal definition.
Yeah.
With an American binding, shall we say? This is one of the very important validities of Dr. Harmon's argument for a multitude of voices.
Let me add one more voice, gentlemen, that is often obscured, and it's strange. I began noticing that even our best so-called terrorism experts, and of course now we have hundreds, all say one thing, and that is that it's such a nasty word. The guys who do terrorism would sure never apply it to themselves. That could not be more wrong. Whether it's a communist like Carlos Maragela writing his famous mini manual in 1969, or the author of the so-called Call to Global Islamic Resistance in 04-05, a very famous man, a Syrian, they often say they know what terrorism is and they know why they're using it, and they specifically describe its purposes. Now, I made a lot of studies as well of Muslim warriors who held a nationalist banner, not an Islamist, in Algeria in the 50s. And again, several of those people were famous for quotations which suggested they know exactly how terrorism works and they're very glad to be practicing it. They can understand the difference between that and, say, guerrilla war against French forces in Algeria. Short of it is, many terrorists have used the word to describe themselves, their own activities. Read Inspire magazine by Al-Qaeda. Read Dabiq by ISIS. They'll tell you what terrorism is. So half of our academics are still worrying about why there's 100+ definitions. But the terrorists, I think, understand quite well what they're doing, and they know they're not mainstream. And in fact, their tactics are designed to drive good Muslims into a polarized society in which they're more likely to join the bad guys.
Okay, I've got some questions coming in now, gentlemen, so I'm going to try to ask a couple of those. From Tobias, whether there is a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, do either of you foresee an appetite to strengthen our non-kinetic counterterrorism tools and focus on countering totalitarian Islamism? Or will great power competition vis-a-vis China and military innovation drown out these efforts for the foreseeable future?
Mike, I'll jump and then I'll be quiet and let Doug take over. Mr. Trump made a very fine speech in May of 2017 when he was overseas, and he said some of the right things, but it's not a main part of his administration. He has great power focus, and we understand that. And I know Biden had decades in public life, but has shown no particular interest in this important line of work. Doctor, do you agree with me?
Based on the 20 years of failure that we've had, it's difficult to be optimistic about improvement.
Right.
I would point out, however, that given the costs of the hard power necessary to prevent us being faced with the choice of war or the collapse of global order, we're talking about a budgetary rounding error. We're talking about hundreds of millions, no more.
Okay, but so you've been mentioning here that we haven't succeeded, but what is success? Because these are thousands of people that have been radicalized far away from our shores, although there's some here in this country. But what is success? I think most administrations have been trying to bomb ourselves into success. But what does success look like in the next 5 years? That we somehow will convert people?
I would say that the ultimate success, and I'm not claiming that we would deliver this, the ultimate success is to make totalitarian Islamism a laughingstock the way the novel Don Quixote made knighthood a laughingstock. But the word that I would emphasize, what we're looking for, is marginalization.
Okay.
I don't expect the threat to disappear, but I expect if we follow the kind of informational strategy that Dr. Harmon has outlined, along with the coordinated use of all other instruments of power, we can reduce the ability of the totalitarian Islamist network to recruit and to operate. And the less visibly they operate, the more difficulty they will have in recruiting. You know, as the redoubtable Margaret Thatcher said, attention is the oxygen that terrorism breathes. You know, not her words exactly. And marginalization is what success looks like. But you know, the more broadly, the United States needs to develop the capability to deal with multiple serious threats at the same time. We created, I contend, the current era of great power competition by neglecting the possibility of future great power competition for 25 plus years after the end of the Cold War, for conducting the global war on terrorism, as it was originally called, as if there would be no great power threat.
Right, the end of history and the last man, Francis Fukuyama.
Unfortunately so, but I don't want to blame an individual for thinking.
No, I know Frank. It was an interesting Hegelian treatment, but history doesn't end because human nature doesn't end, and it doesn't improve. We have a question from one of our audience. Where do you see the fight against radical Islam going in 2020 and beyond? And maybe the other side of that question is, where are they heading? We're going to have an election here in November. We're going to have a new administration. Will they business as usual? Will they have different tactics for different presidents if we have a different president? What do you gentlemen think?
I'll say a word just because I want to hope the next administration gives this issue some prominence, despite what Doug and I have said that's pessimistic. There are people out there with proven government spirit and experience. Miss Farah Pandith, who was a emissary to Muslim countries for us up until about 14. Alberto Fernandez, who's been a top guy at state and in international broadcasting. Robert Riley, who used to run a VOA and is now at the Westminster Institute. These are the kind of Americans we've had that are expert at dealing with the issues in these things without getting into unnecessary quarrels, who can show leadership. People like this need to be in the National Security Council or in a special task force, and they need to be given a lot of rein. Doug and I agree, they don't really need much money. We need emphasis and we need imagination. Imagination is free. We have a lot of money. We have huge bureaucracies. They're not very good. We have a big bureaucracy in public diplomacy. It's just not very good. We need imagination. We need new arguments. We need new energy. We need some young people. And whatever administration's elected, that's the kind of person I want to see charge into this job.
Okay, I've got a few other questions before we close out here. The Chinese are notorious for oppressing the Uyghur minority to their west, and I believe those are all Muslims. What impact, if any, does that have on this conversation? Are the Chinese putting fuel in the fire, or is that just different than that?
Well, the Muslim states have been surprisingly reluctant to condemn China, as partially because some of them, certainly Iran, see China as a very, very valuable partner or ally in confronting the West. In fact, the uncertainty about the continuing U.S. role in the Middle East has made a number of countries in that region look to China as a possible alternative. But my sense is that just as in a number of other areas, it will grow increasingly difficult for the Chinese to escape the consequences of their actions.
Chris,
But
do you agree with that, Chris?
Mike, what I would say is not to differ with Doug at all. I got some wonderful briefings years ago on the developing Uyghur situation, and it's sickening. And it's why people like Doug will actually use the word like Stalin in a discussion of a foul ideology that comes after Stalin, like Islamism. What the state's doing is an example of Chinese totalitarianism. The Uyghurs are the victims. China's actions are based upon some slurs, very little real information, and a lot of fear. And the fear is that over the border influence from Islamist organizations may stir some of these guys up. And the larger fear is that it's a discernible entity which they may not be able to control. And this is exactly why totalitarian states often break up such populations and literally send them as migrants to other parts of the territory to weaken the demographics. So what's happening is despicable. What can we can do almost nothing about it, but keep some profile on it. There are still probably narrow, I really underscore that, narrow ways, as in, for example, money laundering, organized crimes linked to terrorism, particular Islamist travelers in Asia. There are some narrow areas in which we can collaborate with Beijing, and we should. We really should. But they are narrow, and compared to the horrors of what's going on in the Uyghur area, they aren't a top priority of U.S. policy.
Okay, I want to close with the. Go ahead, Doug.
I'd just like to underline that the term totalitarian applies to the PRC and also, in my judgment, to Putin's Russia. The totalitarian Islamism is not the only totalitarian threat that we face.
Yeah. Matter of fact, for most of world history, that's what we had until about 1776.
But I disagree with that, actually. That totalitarianism is a distinctly modern phenomenon. It's not the same thing as absolute monarchy.
I see. Well, fair enough. I stand corrected. I think you're right. What I guess was talking about was sort of no natural rights, no representational government. But totalitarianism is a whole degree worse than a monarchy.
Despots and totalitarians both have been using the counterterrorism argument to crack down on their own people.
Yeah.
This has confounded some of our social science friends, and it really shouldn't. The misuse of a term like terrorism, just because it's a nice thing to strike an enemy with, it shouldn't be that distracting. The best definition of terrorism I've heard, and it's one we can all rely on, and it carefully distinguishes the problem from, say, political dissidence, which is totally normal and admirable sometimes, and that is that terrorism is the deliberate and systematic murder, maiming, and menacing of the innocent for a political purpose, maiming and menacing to inspire fear for a political purpose. And that comes out of a think tank in '79. It's probably very about the best definition of terrorism, but it sure distinguishes it nicely from normal political dissidence.
Okay. So many questions, so little time. I think we only have about 3 minutes left. I wanted to ask finally about Islam and self-government versus Sharia law. Are there, I think maybe it's just Indonesia, are there governments that are majority Muslim countries that have what we would consider a democratic republic, or is that problematic because of Sharia law? Civilians like myself don't know the answer to that.
Well, I would say it's problematic because representative government itself is a difficult and rare thing. Not necessarily because of the Sharia. There are very few governments in the Islamic world that claim to govern in accord with the Sharia. That is comparatively unusual. And even historically, even a state like the Ottoman Empire had, in fact, a mixed legal system, not a purely Sharia-based legal system. If you think even about some of the groups that contributed to the formation of the United States, such as the Puritans, they held views which were entirely inconsistent with representative government, with freedom of thought, with individual rights. As I said, Islam is what Muslims make it. They can make an Islam consistent with open and representative government. Some Muslim intellectuals actually argue that the correct interpretation of the Quran requires democracy and pluralism.
My gosh.
That's a difficult argument to make, but the point is that they make it. And if Muslims come to believe in the value of open and representative government, they will accept that interpretation.
Thank you, Doug. Because the hour of 6 p.m. East Coast time has arrived, I'm just going to follow up here before we close with some summary comments. I think part of what we heard from Dr. Strustan is that Islamism, or radical in nature, is not a religion so much as an ideology, using a religion, that some of the totalitarian aspects come from earlier Western rhetoric and political thought, for example, Marx, and that one of the things that could help to marginalize them is derision of these activities as really sort of unhelpful to people's future, etc. From Dr. Harmon, I think he wants to go on the offensive, but not with weapons of war so much as weapons of rhetoric and attitude and alliances. The Islamic world has a network of networks, and we have to have a network of networks with the right rhetorical and soft power tools, and not all singing from the same hymn book, but all singing, if you will, good songs. And
more singing,
and cheerfully. We want happy warriors like Reagan, and that the lessons in Cold War were that for 40 some years we had a lot of allies together that had one central idea, and that is this cannot stand. And just like we don't want radical Islamic behavior to stand. And I think those together, what you've done is for an hour given us thoughtful commentary for our guests, and we're honored to have the guests, and we thank them. The Institute of World Politics is a fine place for masters and doctoral students. We focus on training warriors, diplomats, and spies, as we like to say. And these are two of the many excellent professors we have at IWP. So consider joining the student body or sending young men and women our way who can have an interest in those disciplines of statecraft. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to close out now, and we hope you'll tune in again. Go to our website, iwp.edu, for more information about our programs. Good evening.